Welcome to WCG Talks Trials, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of clinical research, sharing the latest trends, insights, and best practices from experts across the industry. In each episode of WCG Talks Trials, we'll explore a different area of the clinical trial industry, while featuring a diverse range of clinical research and medical professionals. If you're passionate about advancing clinical research, improving patient outcomes, and driving healthcare forward, then WCG Talks Trials is the right podcast for you. We are so glad you could join us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly FitzGerald, Executive IRB Chair and Vice President of IBC Affairs at WCG, and I'm thrilled to be your host for today's episode discussing the background and recent advancements in the use of psychedelics in clinical trials. We'll share some insights from a participant's experience as well. Before we dive in, let me remind you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on your favorite listening platforms like Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify, so you never miss an episode of WCG Talks Trials. We are joined today by Currien MacDonald, Medical Chair Director for IRB Operations at WCG, and Sara Reed, a consultant and two-time psychedelic trial participant. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Before I get started, I'd like for you both to tell us about how and why you got involved in clinical research. Currien, can you start us off?
Thanks. Happy to be here. Sure. I got into research first in my explorations outside of my clinical work. I was finding that I was enjoying a lot of other things about medicine other than direct patient care. So I began first with an invitation to be a primary investigator with the University of California program for prisoners. That is, we were researching how prisoner healthcare was delivered and how to improve that throughout the state of California, considering it was so abysmal as to be considered against their constitutional rights. A very intense program with a lot of struggle. However, it did bring into the research field, and especially the importance of having participants provide data to progress for better care for others. That then got me into the research world, at which point I was invited to an IRB presentation and a discussion in pediatric gastrointestinal studies, which I took 11 hours to do my first review, which was very interesting, a great discussion, but it really opened my eyes for how much there was in this field.
Great. Thank you so much. And Sara, can you tell us about how you got involved in clinical research?
Yes. And as Currien said, I'm just really excited to be here. So thank you so much for having me. So I had been diagnosed with anxiety and depression and tried a wide array of prescription drugs that had been sent to me by doctors and therapists and psychiatrists. I even tried things like exercise, yoga, meditation. And my journey through all of this, especially with the prescription drugs, was really long and frustrating. I'd heard whisperings about psychedelics and their effectiveness for people over the years, but I didn't know how to access them safely until I heard someone mention psilocybin clinical trials. So I Googled it, trials near me, and there was a place in Utah that was conducting a trial that I ended up qualifying for. It wasn't psilocybin, but it was another psychedelic, and that's how I was introduced.
Thank you both so much. We're really fortunate to have you here to tell your stories today. So let's dive into our topic for today's episode. Currien, can you give some background on the use of psychedelics in clinical trials in general?
Psychedelics have been used for a long number of years. It started back very much at the start of the modern era of clinical trials. However, at that time, societal factors, including the Vietnam War and the counterculture and social revolutions, pulled drugs of this kind into an area that was illegal and associated with a certain kind of movement and people for which to use the word, the establishment wasn't very happy with. And that scuttled the plans for the investigations into these kinds of compounds for quite some time. Things like MDMA, also known as ecstasy on the street, which has gotten some recent use, was used before in recreational use, and that resulted in its criminalization and not a lot of interest in having products that were criminalized be further studied. It wasn't taken up seriously until about the turn of the century, that is 2000 for esketamine, and 2011 for MDMA research to start. That's the compound that's used, especially in some post-traumatic stress disorder studies. It really started to pick up around then, and it's been just an exponential growth, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, with the appreciation that these compounds in the things that people were touting them for, especially in the movements that had them be used in quote recreational situations, could be used in people with diseases and mental health disorders, and really produce some profound steps in progress in that area.
So, how have things changed in terms of the acceptance of the use of psychedelics among adult and medical professionals since then?
Really a mixed response in the terms of acceptance of the use of psychedelics. It's made even more difficult by the lack of clear understanding what we're talking about. The term psychedelics, from especially a scientific and mental health issue, is very widespread. There's LSD versus MDMA, both lumped into this terminology, but they're very different acting substances, very different risk profiles, and very different ways they could possibly be abused and by whom. MDMA use by people without serious mental health issues in a party environment is also very different than it's used in someone with PTSD for a therapeutic purpose in a therapeutic situation. So a news headline that says, hey, they're going to legalize ecstasy gets an immediate emotional reaction, completely not appreciating that that's a very different scenario than I've got a medicine that could be used to treat a disease for which there's no good treatment right now. That latter perception is really how some clinicians and especially researchers who are looking for things better and for needs that aren't met are seeing it and really exploding the idea. That data is trickling down slowly. The last, however, is the idea of using psychedelics for mental health among mental health providers. So mental health providers being this cross-cutting, not researchers, but not general public, has really changed. Not a universal by any means, but as mental health becomes more recognized generally as not an incurable character flaw, but a disease like any physical one, there's a paucity of effective treatments as really asking us look at the potential utility of these compounds and other compounds that may help here.
So, if we're looking at these as clinical treatments, then what's the latest from FDA on psychedelics?
Great. And that is kind of though where the rubber meets the road on understanding. I can test something in a clinical trial, but without having it be approved and then being approved in a way that mental health professionals can use appropriately, it's kind of dead in the water. I just heard a presentation from the very smart and dedicated director of the Division of Psychiatry, leading attention to real progress that's made. FDA is really working hard on a number of fronts in this area. There's these off-label uses of ketamine, these ketamine clinics that are concerned, but also a signal. And they're very much hearing both problems with it and the fact that there's a big need in the society for these. They have breakthrough designations delivered for a couple of compounds. That is special attention from FDA for MDMA and CYB003, a psilocybin-like molecule, for example. Compass Pathways is one sponsor that's been working on psilocybin, and there's others that are working with FDA, such as GH Research for relative of MDMA, Mindman, working with LSD and others. It is kind of sad that Lykos's NDA for MDMA for treating post-traumatic stress disorder resulted in the request for another phase 3 trial. Some could see that as a setback. It's hard to tell so far. The FDA is having a meeting on September 7th, looking particularly at PTSD and some avenues forward. So they may be providing more information about how all the work that has been done in that area would go forward. And that would be in line with what FDA is looking for now. They are very much supportive of trying to bring products to market that will help people with unmet needs.
Can you talk a little bit about some trials that are underway right now to address those unmet needs?
A great question. And it is part of another factor that goes into it, in that we really need to wait for publications and firm data. Part of the difficulty that patients and FDA struggle with is the separation of hope, fear, and fact. I can see there's a lot of research going on, promising data that needs to be followed through and actually made into realization that is suggestive of benefit that far exceeds risk. Treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse, and OCD. These are diseases that have very large impacts and not great treatments. So we have promising evidence that they deserve more study, and especially studies that involve, okay, what are the environments and what are the situations that they can be safely used in this context of they may come out of a history of a legal substance and the potential for abuse. As much promise as we're seeing, we also see risk and want to make sure that we don't put the cart before the horse or scuttle a promising compound for a lack of careful attention.
Thanks. Do you have any insight into how clinicians experience these types of psychedelic trials?
We have some survey data and some limited experience from that view. It is an area that I would say deserves research and get study as well. These clinicians in these trials are often unable to be blinded, just like the participants. So it really is a difficult thing for them going into these trials. They're working with people who are usually substantially affected by their disease and are really wanting to have these participants who they're balancing that thing that always happens in clinical medicine of, I have a patient who has a need. I'm also an investigator trying to see if something works or not. And they're in that same situation. There is the general feeling that they have a positive potential, but also an appreciation for risk. And a lack of knowledge of exactly what those risks are and how to manage them makes them go into these trials with trepidation and hope at the same time. I've also done interviews with clinicians of psychedelic trials that show just how hard this work is and how dedicated these professionals really are.
Thanks for sharing that. And we're also fortunate to have Sara here with us. And Sara participated in 2 psychedelic trials. Welcome again, Sara, and thank you for being here to share your experience with us. Can you provide us with some background from your perspective as a participant in these trials?
Yes. And thanks again for having me. I really feel lucky to be here and lucky to talk about my experience. So I'd never been part of a clinical study before. I had heard about it, but didn't really know much of what to expect. I knew that essentially it's to see what works and have some data behind it. And at this point, I was just, as I mentioned earlier, I had tried so many different prescription drugs and gone through a roller coaster of emotions. And so this was kind of my next step. And I was excited that this was an option. So clinical trials. I go in and initially there's a lot of paperwork, which I expected. I expected the other kind of poking and prodding, like blood work and urine samples and that sort of thing. But then there was a more sort of different testing that I didn't really expect, or I couldn't have fathomed, I guess, was when they took out this mess of cords and cables with nodes on them and put them all over my head and stepped out to make these tests. And it was in this moment where felt more like I was in a sci-fi movie moment. And through this type of test, these more odd tests, I kept wondering, like, dude, does this look normal? Like, are my measurements normal? And so I would ask, the person conducting the study, and they'd tell me, they'd answer and be like, yeah, sure, in the moment. But I was never handed any results. So I didn't have any results at the end to kind of look back on. That was kind of my initial perspective on clinical trials.
Thanks. I mean, that makes sense that you kind of want to check in as you go, but part of the issue with research is that you're blinded to what's going on sometimes. Can you share a little bit more about what those visits were like? Kind of walk us through what one was like.
Yes. Okay. So for one, they'd walk me down this white hallway of doors, and there was sound machines at the base of each door. This was another kind of one of those sci-fi moments, because every time I'd go, I'd wonder which door that they were going to, put me in, and I'd wonder what was going on behind the other doors. So those were kind of an unusual experience. And then for other times, I'd show up, they'd walk me into a room. The coordinator would walk me into a room with this computer, and where someone would be on the computer to ask me a series of questions. The questions were a lot to do with anxiety and depression. So this is normally kind of emotional for me. It wasn't unusual for me to cry, because I'm talking about personal things. And then when I finished with that person on the computer, it was like a video call. Then I'd let the coordinator know that I was done. And then the coordinator would lead me to another room with another computer set up to talk to another person from another organization that would essentially ask me the same questions, maybe small variations, but it'd be the same ones. Again, quite emotional. As I said, this is personal. This is dealing with my anxieties and depressions. And so even now, as I talk about it, it's a little emotional. But then sometimes, so usually it would be like two people I talk to. And oftentimes there'd be even a third, someone on site that I talked to that would ask the same questions. So needless to say, it was quite an exhausting process, though I pushed through because I really believed in pushing something forward that is more effective than what I'd previously gone through.
Thanks. I mean, that really helps paint a picture for what those visits were like and what it's like to be a participant in a trial like this. How did your expectations compare to your actual experience in the study?
Yeah, it's a great question. I really tried to not have expectations as much as I could, especially for the LSD trial. There's a lot of history and talk, as Currien mentioned, about psychedelics and LSD in particular, the dangers. I'd grown up being told that if you took LSD, you didn't respect the country. A lot of them would go mad. What would happen if I were to take this? But then with my new research, realizing that maybe there was actually a lot more benefit than harm. So because of this kind of rich history, I tried to clear any expectations to not feel like it would, one, cure me, or two, scare me off. And the actual experiences were quite intense for me. I could talk about each experience for days. Each one was kind of individual, and the LSD one, that was an all-day thing. I could talk all day about many portions of that experience. If I were to try to put a timeline, which is very hard to do, but if I were to try to put one and explain it, I would say that it started out very scary and unsettling. And then after kind of facing those moments, it mellowed out later for me and brought some very awe-inspiring and some really lovely moments. It's funny because this is also this kind of timeline that I think happened in the day, even though it's hard to say. This is also how the process has gone for me in the aftermath. It's been a couple of years since then. And initially, I was unsettled and thinking about the experience, and I was scared because of the things that I saw. But over the years, especially now, I remember more of the awe moments, like how incredible the capabilities of my brain. And the brain is so powerful. And then also really leaning on back on a couple of experiences where I felt so calm, more calm than I ever have, which for me, someone who has had years of struggling with anxious tendency and depressive moments, those moments that I can kind of go lean back on are very poignant and very important for me. So that's, to keep it short, that's kind of how I can explain it.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. In your opinion, what are ways trials could continue to evolve with psychedelics to benefit participants?
Yeah, this is a great question. And again, another reason why I'm super grateful to be here today is I kind of wish that there would be more follow-up visits for these trials, because initially there was one the day after dosing day, and it was good to kind of try to process it, though I wasn't really ready. And it would have been nice to keep going back to kind of be forced to process it, because it's a lot happening. It's a lot happening during the day. And I don't really have a lot of people to talk it out with. It's not just a casual conversation to talk about psychedelic experience in a clinical trial. And so I do wish that there would be more follow-up visits. And also, like I said, initially, I think, they never handed me the results. I don't even know how those visits went or came across for me. But I know initially I was unsettled and scared about the dark things that I faced, or the things that I really had to try to push through, which have been beneficial for me in the end. But initially, it was really hard for me to talk about that, or to even understand that was there. And then over the years, now I would talk about it differently. I would say I'm actually quite lucky that I had that experience, because I know now what my brain is capable of. I know that how you view things can change in an instant. Things look differently. Things can look more calm. The same thing can look very scary and unsettling, and then there's just one little switch or a different perspective, and then suddenly you're calm and very present in a good way. So I do wish that there would be more visits, follow-ups, and like I said, that's why I'm really grateful to be here today talking with you guys, because it's kind of forced me to sit down and do a little bit more processing. So that's one thing that I do wish and think would be beneficial, at least for me and maybe others, but to have more follow-up visits, more processing time.
Yeah, it sounds like that transition back to kind of regular care and regular life after research study is something to pay attention to for those who are kind of designing the next phase of trials. And also you mentioned return of results, that you put in the time to do the study. And of course you have that natural curiosity about your own results, but also the results of the trial. And that's another area maybe where in the phase 2 that designers of trials could consider that aspect of it and when it would be possible to do that without impacting the results.
Yes, that would be marvelous, I think.
Thank you. And Currien, after hearing Sara's perspective, how does this compare or contrast with some of the information you shared earlier about the status of this type of research?
Yeah, and it's just so wonderful to hear that perspective, a much more powerful slice of the way research scientists are usually faced with research. Trying to get data to answer a research question, figure out how or even if a psychedelic will work and for what. I mean, each of those data points are a person having an experience, giving of themselves for other, maybe some hope for themselves. And we're working together on this problem of these diseases that we're not treating very well. And for this in particular, Sara's experience shows how complex of a problem we're really looking at here and how much we really have left to learn.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate both of your contributions. I want to thank you both before we wrap up for joining us today and sharing your insights and experiences on this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions or would like more information about this topic, please feel free to visit WCGclinical.com. We hope you found this episode insightful and that you'll join us for future episodes of WCG Talks Trials. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred listening platform as we continue to explore different areas of the clinical research industry. As always, we encourage you to join in the conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear on the show by visiting us at wcgclinical.com/podcast. We're here to serve as a trusted resource as we work to improve lives and accelerate clinical research together.